another Star Mini Gaming YouTube video. In this video I wanted to kind of go in a little bit in depth in something I talked about in my Topic of the Week response of Vince's most current Topic of the Week. And I wanted to look at some of the scenarios from the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game, which if you've watched many of my videos before, I've talked about how in many ways it's a predecessor to Age of Sigmar. There are several rules in Age of Sigmar that you can see that directly draw from the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game, and it was it still exists, but it's just not, in the same full-scale production as it used to be by GW. They still produce some models. It's just not supported in the same degree. But when it's really that game that was a similar scale to how you play Age of Sigmar. It had monsters and heroes and all that play very similar to Age of Sigmar. And in terms of like the feel of them, how monsters behave, how heroes behave, things like that. And it was, especially during the original trilogy of Lord of the Rings movies, a very successful game for them, and really, in a lot of ways, was kind of their grand experiment into what I would say kind of like a mid-scale skirmish level game, right? Like you typically have more in the Lord of the Rings and in Age of Sigmar, more models on the field than you do, say, in like a Mordheim or some of the other games that they had that were more of like an individual squad-based game. But anyways, in the later edition of Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, there were kind of the generic scenarios that came into being. These are similar to, if you're used to 40k, the different ones, such as like the Altar of War scenarios and all, where you have them in your central rulebook that you can roll for to determine what game type you're playing. And there was, there wasn't any necessarily like roll to pick these, although a lot of times that's what you would do. There were just several different kinds of scenarios, so that if you played any kind of tournament or whatever, you really encouraged you to field a well-rounded army, not just the best combat troops. So I want to talk about just a couple of these. These are generic, and real briefly go over a few of them that I really liked, and talk about how they can be easily adapted to Age of Sigmar, because that's one of the great things about Age of Sigmar. It is such an open system that it's really easy to borrow from other games and kind of import them into Age of Sigmar. I'd like to do a couple other videos in the near future where I go through some of the older books, such as the original Fellowship of the Ring and several of the others. I have almost every rule book and expansion that was ever released for the game, which is quite a few. And just look at some of the scenarios that I particularly liked and think would be interesting within Age of Sigmar, and talk about how to kind of port those over. So, without further ado, let's begin on the generics. So, the first one that's the most simple is To the Death. I'm not going to really focus on that one. That's basically a pitched battle with a few differences, basically, in terms of in the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game, there was the concept of a force being broken. Whenever you had lost 50% of your numbers or more, you took a courage test, which is similar to a leadership test in 40k, or testing at the end of the combat phase in Age of Sigmar to see if your model fled. Now, unlike in 40k, where you just fall back and you can potentially reform your squad, in the Lord of the Rings game, it was very similar to Age of Sigmar, where if you failed your courage test, the model was removed from the battlefield automatically as a casualty. So, To the Death is, you get victory points based upon if your opponent's broken, and then you get bonuses if you're not. You get bonus points for did you inflict wounds or kill the enemy commander, and did you have a banner on the field. And you can, of course, adapt that to Age of Sigmar, but that's not really anything that different from probably the way that anyone who has much experience in any real war game would just naturally play a pitched battle. But the second one, which was my personal favorite in the Lord of the Rings game, was Domination. And basically, it was that you would place 5 objective markers, similar to how 40k does it now. I know 40k typically is 6, but you'd have 5 objective markers scattered across the battlefield. And basically the way you do it was you would place one in the center of the board, and then you would roll basically to see who got to place the next one, and then you would alternate back and forth until all 5 had been placed, and you got 3 victory points for each objective marker that you controlled without an enemy being within 3 inches of it. You scored 1 victory point if you controlled a victory marker that had, or an objective marker that had more of your units than an opponent's units within 3 inches. You scored 1 victory point for inflicting a wound on the enemy commander, or 3 if you killed them instead. And you scored 1 victory point if the opponent's force was broken, and 3 if they were broken and you were not at the end of the game. And these are games that, you know, that it went until one of the two forces was reduced below 25%. So you were guaranteed that one of the two armies was going to be broken. But anyways, you know, that would be pretty simple to adapt to Age of Sigmar. You'd have 5 points scattered around the battlefield and claim and hold them. It's a pretty simple, you know, objective-based game, but I enjoyed the fact that there were 5, because, you know, it meant that there was more things to protect and more things to go for. The most recent time I played that, it was a lot of fun because there was that initial kind of surge in the middle to gain control of kind of the center of the board, and then whoever did, you know, would kind of like press out and try to, you know, split their force into like maybe a 1 or 2 prongs to hit the enemy, but they also had to think defensively because you need at least 3 out of the 5. So if you had gained the middle initially, but you overextend, then you could potentially lose the middle one while not gaining either the other 2 on your opponent's side and lose the game. So it's certainly not hard to adapt that one. I personally really like scenarios like that are kind of slightly altered to make your own objectives on your side worth like 1, the one in the middle worth 2, and your opponent's one's worth 3, so that it really is an incentive to go and conquer where they are, not just sit back and hold your own. The next one is Hold Ground, which was a very interesting one. You only had a single victory point, or objective point, and you had 1 victory point for each of your models within 6 inches of it, and then you had the traditional, you know, victory points for causing wounds on the opponent commander or killing him, and force broken, and is yours not broken, then you gain bonuses. And that one was really interesting because you had a special rule called Maelstrom of Battle, which, you know, the Hold Ground one isn't particularly, again, a unique type of scenario, but the Maelstrom of Battle rule was really neat because in the Lord of the Rings strategy battle game, in the later editions, every model acted independently, but for building your forces, you had to build within the force organization what was called war bands. And a war band was you would pick 1 hero, and then up to 12 warriors of any kind, so infantry, cavalry, or monsters, and those would basically form a squad called a war band, and the only time that ever mattered was for building your force and for deployment. Once the game started, every model acted independently. They didn't have to stick together. There's no squad cohesion. They weren't really a squad. It was simply a mechanic for organizing your force to bring onto the table. But in Maelstrom of Battle, you would roll a die for each warband to determine where it came onto the battlefield. So on a result of 1, it did not arrive that turn. On a 2, your opponent chooses a point on the north or south board edges at least 6 inches from a corner, and then the warband came on. On a 3, your opponent chose the same thing but on east or west. On a 4, you chose north or south. On 5, you chose east or west. Or on a 6, you got to choose any of the 4 table edges. And that would be easily adaptable into Age of Sigmar, you know, if you just chose basically by the unit or the squad to roll for individually. I think it could be a really interesting way in Age of Sigmar to kind of have that crazy maelstrom that, you know, this was. And it was neat because you did have the center point, so everything was funneling towards the middle, and you know, it made for a pretty entertaining, wild, crazy game where you're really hoping, you know, that Unit X comes on whatever certain side that you need to really have, you know, reinforced. Um, it was a pretty fast-paced, fun game. Lords of Battle was a, you know, another slight adaptation on a pitched battle. I'm not really going to go into it in detail here. It's not a bad game mode, but it wasn't a personal favorite of mine. Reconnoiter is my least favorite, but it might actually work a little bit better in Age of Sigmar. Basically, you had a board edge, and your opponent had a board edge, and you each had the long table edges, right? Because it's played on the standard 6x4. And you had plenty of terrain in the middle, and your objective was to take your models and move them off the opponent's table edge. And your goal was to get more of your models off your opponent's table edge than they got off of yours. Basically, you know, it's to kind of represent scouting forces for each of the two armies trying to gather intel. And so, you know, if you were the outnumbered force, or if you were close in the same size, you know, to the same size of forces, you had to balance rushing your units off the other table edge as opposed to preventing the opponent from getting off your table edge. And you gained a victory point for each model that, you know, went off the opposing side. You had the excuse me, the standard victory scoring for, you know, wounds versus killing your opponent leader, 1 versus 3, and 1 versus 3 on if your army was broken. And then you had special rules where that you only actually you didn't actually deploy any models at the beginning of the game, and each turn you would roll for each warband. And on a 1 through 3 it wouldn't arrive, and on a 4 through 6 it would. You'd pick any point along your long board edge, but at least 6 inches from the corners. And if you rolled a 1 through 3 for your warband, you would make note of it, because next turn you'd get a +1 to your die roll, and that would stack. So if you rolled 1 through 3 twice, then you would get a +2 on your next roll. But anyways, it was really interesting. You know, it was like, in the context of SPG, I didn't particularly like it only because you would quite often get cases of, like, you know, of people kind of, you know, gaming the system, as opposed, especially in tournaments, as opposed to playing that specific scenario. But in Age of Sigmar, you know, with the way the game works, the fact that in Age of Sigmar it's easier to move more quickly than in the Lord of the Rings game. For example, in Age of Sigmar we have the ability to move and run and, you know, and charge. You have those 3 different potential movement options each turn. Not that you can typically do all 3. Some units can, but normally you can't. But in the Lord of the Rings game, you had your flat movement, that was it. And your movement was a little bit slower. Like, your average infantry for, like, a man-sized character was 6 inches, a dwarf was 5, and a hobbit was 4. You know, goblins were 5 as well as dwarves, and things like Uruk-hai, orcs, whatever, were 6. And then you had cavalry, which was typically 10, but there were some very fast cavalry that were 12. Things like the fell beast that the Nazgul ride on in the movies, and the eagles was 12. Most monsters were around 6, some were a little bit faster. But anyways, you know, it was a game mode that was somewhat difficult in the Lord of the Rings game, I feel, because movement was somewhat limited. In Age of Sigmar, you know, obviously one of the potential things that you have to overcome in Age of Sigmar is that you are so quick moving, so it's possible for you to get off the opponent's table edge very quickly. But another aspect of that really quick movement is that you can move so quickly that you can react quickly to your opponent's movement. So preventing your opponent from being able to, you know, get their units off the table is a you know, a much more real possibility of you being able to move and react. So I am intrigued. I'd like to try it out within Age of Sigmar to see how it works. Obviously, I'd probably want to slightly amend the victory point for each model, maybe victory point for each wound that you get off the table, simply because, you know, some armies, all Skaven or Death, I feel like my Death faction, for example, would be potentially overpowered in that scenario, because I could sit back there with my summoner and be like, oh, I don't know, like 10, 12 inches off my table edge, and all my opponent's unit, I just let my opponent like march all their models off the field, and I just sit there with my summoner near my opponent's table edge. I'm like, summon, move off the table, summon, move off the table. Excuse me. So maybe with a game mode like that, you would need to cap it at you cannot accrue more points than what you started in terms of total wounds, and have like a wounds cap on that particular game mode. Again, it's just ideas. Like, the whole point of this video is to share what I think would be fun game modes to play, fun scenarios to kind of port over. And Reconnoiter, although I didn't really enjoy it in the Lord of the Rings game, I do think that it's a scenario that, with some adaptations, could honestly be great within the Age of Sigmar, especially if you were playing it linked to some larger campaign. But that's going to go ahead and be it for this one. Please comment below if you have any ideas on how to adapt any of these, maybe especially Reconnoiter. I am particularly interested in trying that one in Age of Sigmar. But I will continue this series. I'm going to go a bit more into some of the narrative-based scenarios from the Lord of the Rings, and see how I could adapt those same scenarios within the Age of Sigmar game. But until next time, this is James, and happy gaming.